Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back from snack break and welcome back to Assembly TV. Each day of assembly at 3 p.m. Pacific is a lecture from a third-year student in the PSU Art and Social Practice MFA program. It's their third year, so that means that they are days away from graduating. Each person on each day will give an overview of the work they've done during the 3 years of the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Jarrett for a more in-depth introduction to the upcoming lecture. She is an associate professor of community and context arts at Portland State University's School of Art and Design and co-founder and co-director of KS MoCA and the Harriet Tubman Middle School Center for Expanded Curatorial Practices in Northeast Portland. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Kira, for a lovely introduction. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to be introducing the 2021 MFA candidates in Art and Social Practice at Portland State University. This afternoon, at least on Pacific Standard Time, 3 p.m., 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I have the honor of welcoming Nolan Hanson. Nolan Hanson is an artist based in New York City whose practice includes independent work as well as collaborative, socially engaged projects. Their work has been shown across the country in cities like New York, Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, and Cincinnati. In 2017, Nolan started Transboxing, an ongoing art project in the form of a boxing club, which centers trans and gender variant people. This will be the focus of their talk this afternoon/evening. And Nolan, take it away. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the introduction. I'm really grateful, and thanks, Kiara, for hosting, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm really it's really great to see everybody here. Some people I haven't seen in quite a while, and I'm excited to share my work with you. I'm hoping that you get something from the talk, and I'm going to be talking primarily about my graduate project, which is called Transboxing. And I'm going to provide a little bit of context and history that kind of frames how I think about the project and sort of how it's evolved over the last 4 years now, and particularly over the last 3, while I've been in the program. I'm smiling because my trainer just came in. Okay, so now I'm gonna try to not be distracted by the waiting room. I'm used to being on host duty. And I'm gonna share my screen and go into my presentation. Great. All right. How does that look?
Looks
Looking
great.
good?
Yeah, we're good.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So my name is Nolan Hanson. It's really, like I said, great to see you all. And I am going to be talking about my work and my graduate project, which is called Transboxing. And I wanted to open with a quote by the artist Paul Chan, which is, "Art is the form freedom takes without the use of force." So transboxing, for people that are unfamiliar with it, like Lisa said, it is an ongoing collaborative art project in the form of a boxing club that centers the participation of trans and gender variant people. And over the last 4 years, the project has served as a platform for community building, education, and mentorship, primarily through training, workshops, conversation. And it's also helped me relate to myself, other people in the world around me. I included a picture of myself as a child because, just for some context, when I was a kid, my ability to be myself was in direct relationship to my proximity to athletic spaces. And, so beyond kind of the obvious benefits of sports for a lot of people, psychological and physical, they provided me a context where my gender expression was permissible. And as I entered adolescence, the directives around gender became sharper, and it became harder for me to participate in organized sports because they were so rigidly gendered. And it's starting to become very clear to me that there was a legibility that I was failing to give the world around me. It was expected, and I kind of just always was met with like, I'm not fulfilling the expectations. It's really confusing experience. And Leslie Feinberg, trans activist and scholar, wrote in Stone Butch Blues about their experience that they longed to, in their words, nestle my skin against the comfort of sameness. And I related to that a lot. So when I entered high school,
Hey, Nolan.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to interrupt your flow.
No, it's okay.
Can you just do a quick check on your screen share? It looks like a part of it is getting cut off. We can see most things. Would you just try refreshing that?
Totally. Thank you for letting me know, Lisa.
I can also see the browser too.
Okay, that's okay, because I am in presenter mode, but how's that? Is that any better?
That's a little bit better, yes. Becca, is that better from your side? I'm gonna assume yes, and Nolan, I'll throw a note in the chat so I don't interrupt your speaking. That was a good moment. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. You can actually feel free to just interrupt me that way, Lisa, because I don't think I can see the chat.
Okay.
So thank you so much. So as I got a little bit older, I struggled with kind of just substance use disorder, mental health kind of stuff, and actually almost was expelled from school. So when they let me back in, I was on this behavioral contract, and I had to reach, certain academic and behavioral standards. I started to spend a lot more time in my art classes, and through my time in my art classes, I did a lot of ceramics, painting. I was presented with an opportunity to volunteer at a local art studio that worked with artists with disabilities, and it was called ACAP, the Adaptive Community Approach Program. The studio was called Art Links, and it was part of a larger organization. And the larger organization had other programs like recreation, education, advocacy related things. And so through my work here, I was introduced to like really influential philosophical ideas relating to the effects of marginalization, and also socially engaged strategies and ways to mitigate those effects. I also met my friend and mentor, Patty, here, who was the director of the ACAP Playmakers, which was an inclusive theater troupe that was a partnership with the Waukesha Civic Theater in my hometown. And Patty encouraged me to apply to college to pursue art. And I enrolled in the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And during my first semester there, I was browsing in the media library, and I came across a documentary called The Aggressives. And The Aggressives is a documentary from the late 90s that features transmasculine people in butch lesbian subculture in New York City, late 90s, early 2000s. And so it's like a pretty significant experience for me, because it was the first time I had really ever seen people with, a similar gender expression to me, outside of talk shows like Maury and Jerry Springer. The people featured in the documentary, they dealt with difficult things in life, but they had full lives. They had friends, and it kind of blew my mind. In my sophomore year, I took a class with a woman named Fo Wilson, who's here today, and I'm so honored to have Fo in the room. And Fo's course was called African American Contemporary Art and Visual Culture. And in her course, she introduced me to a lot of philosophers and theorists and artists, Black, queer, people of color, people making work that I hadn't been introduced to in my other studio-based classes. Fo had a really interesting background. Her work kind of resists categorization, graphic design, art. She's a writer, a curator. One project that was really impactful was a project Fo had done as part of the Negro Art Collective with Renee Cox and Tony Coates. And it was a poster project in which it sought to address misinformation about Black people. They were installed in New York, LA, and well, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Los Angeles. I was also encouraged by Fo to take classes with a woman named Shalene Green, who was teaching a participatory art class, a visual culture seminar, and a multicultural studies class. And between the two of them, I was, again, introduced to artists, movements, historical and artistic movements, and people making work that was just like totally different from anything I had ever seen. And it was, the artists were different than people that I was, being shown in my other classes. And the strategies that artists were using in terms of performance strategies and the ways in which people were approaching their own identities, navigating the social context around them and their place in history, really blew my mind and opened up a lot of, just a lot of like conceptual territory for me that I was kind of desperate to explore, not only because I thought it was brilliant work, but because I felt an identification with what a lot of the artists that I was learning about were exploring. And I wasn't really sure why, as a young kind of closeted queer and trans person kind of trying to find my place. A lot of my work focused at the time on athletics, which I guess, in a way it was kind of my way of returning to that field, which I had been excluded from. And I just researched kind of like, in Shalene's class, she did a lot of analysis-based work, introduced to the field of semiotics and critical theory and stuff that was just way beyond my, where I was at the time, but stuff that just like really impacted me a great deal and expanded for me how I understood that I could be, who or how I could be. And so I researched and analyzed the semiotics of sports and kind of what these signs meant in culture and what they signified in terms of race, gender, and sexuality. One of the most influential works that I was introduced to during this time was a project by an artist named Adrian Piper called Funk Lessons. And in this project, it's a series of classes and collaborative performances in which Adrian Piper, who's a mixed race woman, taught a group of white participants how to dance to funk music. And in Piper's words, the aim of the project was to transmit and share a physical language that everybody was empowered to use. And I was really struck by the generosity of Piper's work. And I was also, it was the educational framework around it, I thought was just really profound. And the suggestion that identity wasn't something that was fixed or intrinsic, but that it was a process that could be learned, also contributed to just like this total shift in my own perspective. So one day after class, I was talking to Shalene and Dr. Green, and I told her, hey, I'm thinking about moving to New York. All these really cool artists that I was learning about were from there, and Fo was from there, and Shalene was from there. I'm like, I guess I should go there, I think. And Shalene just said to me really nonchalantly, oh, you could do it. Yeah, I hear East Flatbush is still kind of affordable. And then the next year I did. And when I moved to New York, I was really eager to return to my art practice, which had been primarily studio-based, and kind of incorporating some participatory elements. But when I rented a shared studio in an industrial area of Greenpoint, I had the intent to go there on my days off. I was working in a restaurant at the time. But the absurdity of like sequestering myself off inside of a building away from a city that was unknown to me to make objects, and I didn't have an audience. Nobody was going to see these things. Yeah, it just, that absurdity was not lost on me. So I spent a lot of my time kind of walking around the city and just noticing things. And I was also going to look at a lot of contemporary art in galleries. I was able to see a lot of the people I had learned about in college. Like they had shows at, you know, at these galleries in Chelsea. And a lot of what I was seeing kind of like looked like things that I would just see on the street. And I just kind of was like, I don't know that that feels right for me. Like I was finding myself wanting to mimic a lot of the artists that I looked up to. But I wanted social connection more. And it didn't seem like going into a studio was going to be how I was going to get that. And so that contributed to this growing criticality of what Harold Fletcher, the director of my program, calls the studio gallery system. And it just didn't really seem like it was a viable option for me. So yeah, I went to that studio in Greenpoint once and had a panic attack and never went back. So I started taking classes at this place. It was called the Bruce High Quality Art Foundation University, and it was started by some Cooper Union graduates as sort of an experimental free art school. And through classes there, I took whatever, you know, I took some theory-based courses, some more studio-based courses, art history stuff. And I was able to do this. What was I doing at the time? I think I was waiting tables and working as a nanny. So went to classes here, like they had kind of a semester system. And I met an artist named Nate Hill, who became a friend of mine. And he was doing all these weird projects just out in the street. Nate Hill is an artist who's mixed race. And this is a project he did called The White Ambassador. It was a performance, and he engaged with people that were on the street in Harlem on, I think, 125th and Lexington. And that just sort of blew my mind that that was possible, that you could make art, that you didn't have to have, you know, an association with a reputable gallery. And so that inspired a project I did in 2016 called Bryant Park Shoeshine. And in the project, I had a pair of all white Air Force Ones shined with black polish at a shoeshine stand on 42nd Street, right across from the restaurant that I worked at the time. And so this shoeshine stand, I had never seen a shoeshine stand before. That wasn't part of, you know, the landscape where I grew up. It just was like really bizarre to me. And so when I would pass it walking to work, I noticed that overwhelmingly the two employees who worked at the shoeshine stand were Black, and overwhelmingly the people getting their shoes shined were white. And from a lot of what I had done in my undergraduate, I was kind of like looking at racial dynamics just in all parts of my life, thinking about whiteness, Blackness, how these things are communicated, expressed, articulated in society. And I wanted to do something with that situation of the shoeshine that kind of made the social dynamics of race and class more visible, because other people didn't really seem to think twice about the shoeshine stand. And so one day, as I was either coming or going from work, I went up to the man who was working there at the time. His name was Hector, and I told him about my project and what I had wanted to do, to see if he was willing to participate. And we worked out compensation. I asked him if I could document the work, and he agreed to. So I did this project, and then it was later supported through a public art festival in New York called Art in Odd Places. And yeah, I was able to, like, that kind of, I don't know, I feel like it was sort of, it just validated me enough to keep me thinking that I could make art somehow. So when I moved to Bed-Stuy with my twin in 2015, we lived in a family home, and this is on the 500 block of McDonough Street. We lived right up there in those big, on the third floor, those big windows, large bedroom, and we sectioned it off. So we had like our living space, and we each had our beds in these little areas and a divider. But we were the only people outside of the family that lived in the home. And the home was owned by a woman named Ms. Riggins, who we would later call Auntie, but she has the same name as my twin, Nadine. So when we met her, we connected instantly. She's a Gemini. She said she thought maybe because we were Geminis. And before we left, she looked at my twin and she said, "So you're a real Nadine, huh?" Nadine's like, "I guess." So, but living in a family home like really informed my own perspective of the neighborhood and the complex social dynamics that played out within it. And living with a Black family didn't make my own whiteness invisible. And I often thought about how I was complicit in issues of racial inequity and gentrification that were occurring in the neighborhood. And when I would take a cab home after a night out, inevitably a driver would say something like, "I never would have dropped someone like you off here 10 years ago." And, you know, I had expected New York City to be diverse, but in many ways, I was really surprised by how homogenous it could be. It seemed like people tended to hang out with people in their similar social groups, similar educational background, cultural background. So in some ways, the divisions were porous, like on the train or, you know, just walking down the street. And in other ways, they felt kind of impenetrable. But shortly after I moved to that neighborhood, I joined the New Bed-Stuy Boxing Center. And this is a community-run gym, formerly known as the Bed-Stuy Boxing Club, and it was founded by the late George Washington. And for over 40 years, George trained like thousands of kids and adults in the neighborhood, as well as professional and amateur champions. But I didn't know any of that when I walked in there one day. I just knew that I needed somewhere to put myself. And I was working as a nanny at the time, and every night after my babysitting shift, I got on the B38 bus, took it down Lafayette Avenue. It was usually packed. And this was before, now they have the double buses for the B38, but this is before when they just had the single buses. And I rode it to the gym in Bed-Stuy. Here's some folks from the gym. That's Nate Boyd, who currently runs the gym. And the picture next to that on the left is my first trainer, Charles, and my friend Jaquan. And so through belonging to the gym, I gained an even deeper connection to the community and the people in it. And I had access to athletics again, which I had been denied for over the past 10 years. And over time, the process of training as a physical material process, you know, one of like re-signification, was just really compelling to me and kind of related to some theories I had been introduced to as an undergraduate student. And as I was learning the language, I thought of Judith Butler's ideas on gender and performance, in which she writes that in Gender Trouble, she writes, "Gender is not a noun, but rather an incessant and repeated action. Gender is itself a kind of becoming, an activity, a cultural and corporal action, a practice." In an interview I read with the artist Arthur Jafa after I saw his show, Love is the Message and the Message is Death at Gavin Brown's Enterprise in Harlem in 2016, he said, "If you don't have or don't control material, you have to become material itself." And so through training, it was feeling like my body was becoming the site of my work. And these ideas started to inform a framework that I began to develop around identity and social engagement. In March 2017, I had my first fight in the New York Daily News Golden Gloves semifinals against an opponent named Jewel Lambert from Starrett City Boxing Club. She won. She was an incredible fighter. I had such a good time, but she really got me with a couple good punches. But I was so happy the night after. And this is a picture on the left of me. She was incredible. You know, she was really something. And it's one of the best memories of my life. And on the right, that's what I ate after the fight. I was really, did not weigh a lot at the time, 110 pounds. But shortly after that, I went to the doctor, and an injury I had sustained like a few months prior from training, it was getting worse. He told me that I needed to take a year off of competing. He said, "We're going to have to do the surgery. This is not going to heal on its own if it hasn't already. And a full recovery is a year." So I had to take time off of competition, and I started to kind of reconsider what I was doing. Fighting was really great, but it sort of had me thinking real short term, you know, cut weight, next fight, do this, do that. And so I started to think about what my other goals were in life, and, you know, making art and how I was going to do that. And anyways, one day after work, I was talking to my employer, Amy, who's just a really amazing, generous woman who supported me so much throughout, the last 5 years or so, 6 years. I was talking to her about applying to graduate school, and she mentioned that a friend of hers was an artist, and she thought he might be a good person to talk to. So I contacted her friend, who was actually the artist, Paul Chan, and I arranged a meeting with him at his publishing company, the headquarters of his publishing company in Chinatown called Badlands. And I sat with him and we talked about graduate programs and art. And I told him I had this idea to start a boxing club for trans people. And he thought it was a good idea. And he told me, well, just real matter of factly, here's what I think you should do. Start the project, use documentation from it to apply to graduate school. And yeah, like I said, he mentioned the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State University. And so I listened and I started developing the project, writing notes, making connections with people. And I contacted a local gym owner who had recently opened a small storefront gym on Ralph Avenue and Jefferson Street, a few blocks from my house. And he agreed to host the classes and see how the first one went. So I made some flyers and posted them at different bars and coffee shops and random places in the city, and held the first trans boxing class in July of 2017. And the class was a 1-hour class exclusively for trans and gender variant people and open to people of all experience levels. So the first session was well attended. It had about 14 participants. And then the gym owner agreed to host the classes on a weekly basis. In November, the classes moved to a gym on Bleecker Street in Manhattan called Overthrow Boxing Club. And there we held classes at 4 p.m. every Saturday. By January, 2 collaborators joined the project: Max Adler, an amateur fighter and local trainer, and Hill Corelli-Donnell, a regular participant who had recently moved to New York for graduate school from their home in New Orleans. So during the class, folks would come in, we'd have everyone get their hands wrapped and sign in. They'd put their names, pronouns, email addresses. And we would generally split the class up into 2. We'd do some work on the bags. Max would take care of people in the ring doing drills, and then we'd switch. And I have a short clip from a documentary that a journalism student made for us. And I'll play this. Lisa, I'm looking at your screen. When I play, if you can hear the sound, will you let me know? Cool. Gotcha. Let me see here. It might be because I have my headphones. Let me try this. Let me see. 1 second. Just going to stop the share for 1 second. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to try this again. Share sound. There we go. Optimize. Share. All right, I'm gonna try this again. Let me know.
Try to get a little rhythm. Practice throwing out that jab cross.
I'm Tara Chi. I'm a member of Trans Boxing. As a trans woman, as a woman in general, you have all these things projected upon you. You're expected to wear makeup. You're expected to do feminine things. boxing is probably the last thing that a lot of people consider to be feminine. So the question is like, why the hell would I want to do boxing? For me, it's important to move beyond how trans is limiting to myself. Boxing is a good outlet for being myself in a space, and it's just me and the punching bag, me and that sparring partner.
All right. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Let me just go back in here. All right. So just to give you sort of a feel for what the classes were like, they were real technical boxing classes. And every week after class, we'd go to a quiet bar down the block and just hang out and talk. And these sessions kind of functioned as like informal meetings where people could give feedback and talk about the class, things they liked, maybe things that they didn't like so much. And we'd also just get to, you know, learn about one another and get to know each other. We'd stay sometimes for hours and just build relationships with each other. And these meetings became formalized through these quarterly collective meetings, and we usually met at Whole Foods on Hanson Street, and they were great. I mean, there was a lot of people, a lot of ideas, but what was great was that I got to learn from folks about what they thought would be helpful. And I was also a very brand new member of the trans community. And it allowed me a way to kind of learn about some of the dynamics that were going on there, some of the history, some precedents of things that people had done in the past. And so at this time, I really wanted the project to honor a lot of aspects of the culture of boxing that I'd experienced as a member of New Bed-Stuy myself. And I wanted it to subvert other conventions. You know, just something as simple as asking somebody what pronouns they use can really transform their experience in a space like this. And so I thought that it had the potential to function as a work of art and as an art project. Thought it had the potential to do some things that meaningful works of art do: challenge a dominant system, enact a social critique, subvert hierarchies. But I feared that framing it as an art project could, at least initially, maybe threaten its legitimacy within the existing boxing community. And so I decided to prioritize establishing credibility with sort of the more dominant boxing culture first, while working to develop an artistic conceptual framework. And I was able to do that through becoming a student in the Art and Social Practice program at Portland State. Since the program was flexible residency, it was inclusive to people who didn't live in Portland, and I was able to continue the work I'd been doing in New York. But for the first week of classes, actually the first couple of weeks, I flew out to Portland so I could meet people in person. And this is my first trip out to the West Coast. I was able to join folks on the annual camping trip, which the program does every year, the weekend before the start of the term. And you know, I went to the Oregon coast, and I was able to attend the first week of classes in person with everybody. There's the building where we have our classes. The Art and Social Practice program is, well, it's a very interesting program. And when it started, part of kind of what made it possible was that the director of the program, Harold, said, well, we don't need studios. You know, we can just find a place. If we have a room, we'll be fine. You know, our students work, they don't make studio-based stuff. And so this is the classroom where we had our workshop class. And actually a lot of the other classes are held at a elementary school in North Portland, where the program is connected to a project there called King School Museum of Contemporary Art, which Lisa Jarrett and Harold Fletcher founded. So here's a shot I took of our classroom. Some of the people who are here today are in this shot. I see Bree, and then also have some alumni of the program now: Roshni, Salty, Spencer, Michael. And in the first year, Harold Fletcher told me he wasn't overly concerned with students producing a lot of projects. And I felt like this just gave me the freedom to learn about the field of social practice, its historical precedents, and its relationship to broader cultural, political, and social contexts without the pressure of having to produce new projects. And instead, I could take what I had learned and try to apply it to the project I was developing. And through the program, I gained just like the invaluable resource of the faculty and my classmates who were working in various contexts and had a diverse range of practices. And they listened, when I spoke about the challenges and insecurities and conflicts that arose in the initial stages of transboxing. And their support and critical feedback helped shape the decisions that I made. Critic Nicholas Bourriot describes the contemporary artwork as a social interstice, borrowing a Marxist term meaning intervening space in which experiences and life possibilities are made. Art, he writes, is a site that produces certain modes of sociability, human relations, social exchange, power dynamics, and sociability, in parentheses, human relations, social exchange, power dynamics, and subjectivity. So, as a socially engaged artist, in addition to determining what parameters are needed to create a desired mode of sociability or just a desired way of being in the world, artists who work in socially engaged ways have to also consider their participants they work with and in collaboration with, and the people they work in collaboration with, as well as the audience. And the primary audience of transboxing was the people who were taking the classes. But it was difficult for me to try to figure out how to engage a wider audience outside of that. And what I was able to do pretty successfully in collaboration with some folks that were helping me with the project was engage a greater diversity of participants in the project through connecting with local community organizations. Here's a picture of, I forgot to mention, I'll mention it right now. I went to Portland for the full term of my, full spring term in my first year. And Max and Hill held down the classes, and I'm so forever grateful to them for that. And here they are posting some flyers outside of Callan Lord Community Health Center. And while in Portland, I worked as a teaching assistant for an instructor named Takahiro Yamamoto. Takahiro is a choreographer, performance maker, and artist, and he generously welcomed me into his class. And he taught a foundations level time-based art class, but it wasn't a foundational level conceptually. It was like a really beautiful and comprehensive class. And the concepts introduced in that course and the conversations that Taka and I had inspired me to explore the physical vernacular of boxing as a performance modality. And I experimented with this in a couple performances. This one is a performance I did in collaboration with my friend and collaborator, Marcela Torres, who's been a huge influence of mine and support. And this was a performance we did as a part of an academic conference at Northwestern University, where we held a 45-minute training session in a hotel lobby. In another project I did with my classmate and choreographer, Tia Kramer, and James Hanley, who's a rehabilitations manager at a minimum security prison in Portland called the Columbia River Correctional Institution, we created a performance. This was at the time that Sean Leonardo was doing his piece at the Guggenheim, and also working on Mirror Echo Tilt, the collaborative project that he did with a couple other artists. And he was working with sort of a hybridized movement practice and kind of using athletic kind of disciplines and dance to create sort of a group dialogue, and he was facilitating self-defense workshops and was really influenced by the work that he was doing. Primitive Games, I believe that was the name of his Guggenheim piece. And so I kind of wanted to do something like that. And in this performance, James and I did a movement piece together, and there was a participant component where folks documented the performance by writing an incident report about what they saw. And the physical and emotional states that I experienced while performing were almost indistinct from those that I experienced when I fought. And I thought it was so interesting how just like by changing the context, you could have such a intensely different experience of something that is actually the same thing. It's just the context changed it. And the performances also allowed me to engage a wider audience. So when I got back to New York at the beginning of the school year, I spent my summer, what did I spend? Just doing whatever I was doing, training, holding classes outside. This is known as the infamous top surgery season, in which myself and one of my friends at the time both had top surgery back to back. So late April into early September is now its own season. And so we continued holding classes at Overthrow, The Door, and the Pride Center. Also held a sparring clinic at a gym called Devilfish Athletics in Red Hook. And the project was pretty flexible and nomadic, which was actually kind of nice because then we could engage with different people, and it allowed us to change what we were doing depending on the context. And I think that it kept the project pretty nimble. And one day when I was talking to my professor, Harold, he suggested holding classes inside of an art gallery. And this gesture of taking something that's not typically considered art and placing it within the art context obviously has historical precedence. So in 1917, Marcel Duchamp created probably his most well-known piece called Fountain, in which he took a manufactured urinal, signed it with a fake name, positioned it on its back, rendering it more useless than it even was in the first place, and exhibited it inside of an art gallery. So this supported Duchamp's view that the creative act was not intrinsically linked with creating in the way that we traditionally think about it, making something with our hands, but rather in choosing the object and placing that object in the context. Funk Lessons, the project I mentioned earlier, also happened within an art context. And so, yeah, I was really interested, in addition to the conceptual benefits of the activation, I thought that maybe holding a class in an art gallery could kind of do two things at once. It could introduce boxing to people who are, more comfortable in art spaces, and it could introduce maybe an art space to people that want to box. So I started to experiment with these ideas whenever I had the chance. And I gave a lecture with Hill Corelli-Donnell as part of a fellowship I had done with More Art, an arts organization in New York that supports public art projects. And I incorporated performance elements into the presentation. A couple of months later, in February 2020, I did a similar version of this in San Francisco at the Diego Rivera Gallery. My project, How to Explain Belief, looked at, through a lecture, I looked at some of the ideas presented in a text I had read by an artist named Gordon Hall about belief, ritual, and queer community. I held a public lecture, and then I held a private workshop directly following. In the essay, which I'll just really briefly I'm not going to summarize the essay, I'm going to summarize one small component of it. Gordon Hall cites a religious scholar who kind of suggests seeing belief as a material practice, and that belief is actually not something somebody thinks, but rather something somebody knows with their body. And so I was kind of going through two things, and these are both sparring videos, which in the interest of time, I'm not going to show, but I'm happy to share them with anyone who's interested. But I was navigating my own training at New Bed-Stuy, and then taking what I had learned there and using it, and trying to kind of transmit that to the members of Trans Boxing. whoops, let me just do this. Sorry about that. So a month after I returned from California, the first case of COVID-19 was reported in New York. And I guess it was probably 2 weeks after that, it was on the same night that they closed the schools, I came down with a fever and spent the next 2 days isolated in actually my sister's bedroom. And when I recovered, Hill, Max, and I regrouped and made a plan to start holding virtual classes. It's a screenshot participant, Carrie Thomas, who's been at virtually, I don't know if he's missed a class for the whole, however many months we've been doing them, 14 months or so. In addition to the classes, I started giving participants some assignments as a way to support their own training at home, and would ask them, invite people to submit their assignments in the form of documentation to me, which I thought maybe we could use to make posters or something like that. And I'd still like to. And so during this time, I also had been selected for the artist residency program at More Art. And I had a project budget from that residency and some funds available. So as part of the project, I wanted to make an instructional video. And throughout this time, I had gotten connected to some new people through training with my trainer, Carl, in the park. So I collaborated with some filmmakers that I had met. They're working on a film about transboxing and about Carl, and asked if they wanted to hold a filmmaking workshop. I invited Kamani, a teammate of mine, to the workshop, and he had expressed interest in filmmaking, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to use the resources I had and include somebody in my life, to be able to access those resources. And it also could kind of create an educational experience. It created a context. And in addition to technical filmmaking techniques, Kamani also, Kamani and I got to know each other differently. And we all got to talk about representation and identity. Some shots from the film.
Nolan?
Yep.
Last few minutes, okay?
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So if it's 3:48 now, I wonder if I could do 5 more minutes?
That sounds great.
Okay.
So we leave time for questions. You want me to stop you at 5 more?
That'd be great.
You got it. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. How's that?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Go for it.
So I'm going to speed through this. I'm not going to show the video. But like I said, throughout this time, I'd been training with my trainer. New Bed-Stuy had been closed throughout the pandemic, and we were training outside. It's actually where I met Kamani. And as I got to know Carl a little bit more, I talked to him more about my work and my own identity. And when transboxing classes resumed through outdoor sparring meetups, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to get Carl involved in the work that I was doing and see if he wanted to kind of collaborate. And that's what we started doing. Here's Carl actually holding the mitts for Yue, who helped with the filmmaking workshop. This is Carl and Jay Fan. This is Jay and Marcella, and all of these images were from Gia Lee, who's just been a remarkable person that I've been lucky enough to get connected to. As part of a course I taught in the winter term this year, I invited transboxing participants to come through and have a group discussion. We also worked on a poster project, which was in collaboration with transboxing member Ada Jane McNulty, in which we created portraits that were used for posters. This was published in the Social Forms of Art Journal. I also did an interview with Carl, looking at the history of Bed-Stuy, which was published in the spring edition of the SOFA Journal. And the last project I'm going to talk about is called An Effort to Defend. This was through a residency I did at an arts organization called Wavepool. And in the project, I wanted to do something that put into practice some of the approaches I'd been working with, but that was specific to the local community in Cincinnati. So I did some research on the history and existing culture of boxing there, of which there's a very rich one. And I visited a gym called the Queen City Boxing Club. So the Queen City Boxing Club was founded by a man named Jackie Shropshire and is now run by a man named Frank Rhodes. When I entered the gym, Frank took me around and pointed out all these pictures hanging on the wall and kind of was like acting like a, I don't know, like gave me like a gallery tour almost. And I thought for the exhibition, what might be nice is to take pictures of the pictures that he was showing me and exhibit them in the gallery, and maybe allow people to see them and learn about the history that wouldn't otherwise get to the gym. I also wanted to bring together sort of a lot of these different social worlds that were coalescing in my own life between my work as an artist, my work that I was doing with people at New Bed-Stuy and the relationships I had, and people involved in trans boxing. And so at the exhibition, I exhibited posters that featured people from all three of these institutions. A local musician performed at the opening, a musician named Freedom Nicole Moore. There are the posters of the participants. And I also facilitated an outdoor public screening in a neighbor's backyard. That's Venus right there in the gray hoodie, who generously hosted us. And we watched Frank Rhodes' 1995 USBA super middleweight title fight, which he won.
1 minute, Nolan.
Thanks so much, Lisa. After the fight, Frank, another trainer from the Queen City Boxing Gym named Hardface, and Hardface's wife, came through to the gallery, and we watched the Canelo Alvarez and Billy Joe Saunders fight. It was great because they got to see the work. And now actually, they really liked it, meant a lot to me. And now the posters that I made from the pictures in their gym are going back to their gym. And Frank also requested a copy of the poster that features George Washington, the founder of New Bed-Stuy. This is an image that I took this past March, the same field where I was playing baseball practice, maybe almost 20 years ago now. Thank you so much.
Nice job, Nolan. Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left for some Q&A for Nolan. It's so wonderful to see how many folks have joined. Hey, Hill. I understand Carl might be here too, meeting some folks I've heard lots about. It's really wonderful. But we are in an official sort of mode. And so we have another 7 minutes or so for questions for Nolan from anybody here on the call today. I'll help facilitate. You're welcome to put them in the chat or to just come off mute and ask your questions, no problem.
Hi, Nolan.
Is that Shalene? Hello.
Yes, hello. What an amazing presentation. It's just wonderful to see how the work has developed, from, your upbringing through college, through the program. And I guess, one of the questions that I had was, sort of the idea of negotiating sort of the art spaces with community engagement and thinking about how you feel about that and how did you do that? Because you're negotiating that art world, putting that in quotations, on your own terms. And I was wondering how does that work for you?
Great question. And thank you so much for coming, Shalene. It's amazing to see you. And yeah, negotiating that on my own terms, you know, as you put it that way, I'm like, that sounds pretty good, you know? And I guess I didn't necessarily mean to do that. I really started out being really intimidated by the art world and wanting to be a part of it so badly, but just feeling like I kept coming up against barriers that just signified that it wasn't going to work. And so I think that the art context, I value it a lot because art and artists have shaped my life in such a significant and important way. And at the same time, there's just a lot of components to it that, you know, I've started to see aren't really conducive to like some of the values that I really want to center in my life. And kind of similarly actually to boxing in a weird way, where it's like very much focused on one individual. And there's a lot of kind of commercial interests at play. So I want to kind of take what I really love about these fields and make what I value about them the biggest parts of them, and make the things that I don't feel so great about like the smallest components, and kind of try to find a way to like everyone's got to deal with money, everyone's got to deal with resources, all these kinds of things. But I think, you know, this kind of budding criticality of the art world has been really, I found a good place to kind of talk through that and work through that in the context of this program. Because, and yeah, I've just felt like it was possible for me to make art without having to kind of change my values, you know, and expanding kind of the definition of what it means to be an artist. Who gets to do that, you know? I think sometimes that's, yeah, we have a pretty limited idea of who artists can be and what they can make. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a, you know, a constant negotiation, but there's obviously things I value about the art context, or I wouldn't mess with it. And I think it's been like, I'm kind of now circling back to it after 3 years or so, I feel, in a way that feels better to me. It doesn't feel as scary or something.
That was a great question, Shalene. And I don't have a question, Nolan. I just want to say congratulations, and you're a really good storyteller. And it was great to hear the whole journey to where you are right now. So congrats.
Thank you so much, Fo. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming.
I'm going to potentially pause us here, checking with Kara for a nod maybe. We do have a workshop following this presentation that will give us a little more insight into Nolan's practice. And I think we stay on this link. Is that correct, Nolan?
Yeah. And I think we'll probably, some folks are here who usually do come to the classes. So, you know, just feel free to please stick around. It's going to be a little bit of an abbreviated class, and we'll have more time at the end of that class for like a dialogue and some questions. And yeah, so I think we'll probably start at 5 after 7. And I'll keep in touch with folks in the chat too.
Okay, so this concludes Nolan Hanson's graduate talk as an MFA 2021 candidate in Art and Social Practice at Portland State University. Huge round of applause. Super proud, big smiles everywhere. I'm going to turn it back over to Kara Walls, who's our MC for the day. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody at about 5 after 4 or 5 after 7, depending on which time zone you're in for a workshop. Thank you, Nolan.
Yay, Nolan.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
All right, Nolan. I'm proud of you.
All right, Nolan.
Thank you, Coach. Thank